Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 15, Episode 9. Today, I'm speaking with Irina Janakievska, who is a Macedonian-British writer and recipe developer. Irina was born in Skopje, North Macedonia, then one of the republics of former Yugoslavia, but grew up in Kuwait from the late 1980s onward. In 2001, she moved to London to complete her undergraduate and master's degrees in the London School of Economics, International Relations, and History. After university, a large corporate law firm sponsored her through law school, and Irina became a solicitor. In 2020, Irina left her successful career in corporate and finance law to follow her passion for sharing her love of Balkan cuisine, the Balkans, and its people around the world. Irina completed her culinary training at Leith School of Food and Wine. She has contributed to The Guardian, Foodworks, US, Whetstone Magazine, Mediterranean Lifestyle Magazine, and Pitt Magazine, among others. The Balkan Kitchen was shortlisted for the Jane Grigson Trust Award in 2023 and is her debut cookbook. Irina lives in London with her husband and young son, cooking, researching, and writing about Balkan history, food culture, and culinary traditions. I'll take you now to my conversation with Irina. Welcome to the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. Today we're speaking with author Irina Janakievska, author of The Balkan Kitchen, which came out in October. Irina, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on, Dean. Pleasure to be here.
So I want to start off by asking you, what inspired you to write a cookbook focused on Balkan cuisine, a region often overlooked by culinary literature?
So I was born in North Macedonia, which was, at the time I was born in the early 80s, part of the former Yugoslavia, and which is obviously a country that no longer exists. And I'm old enough to remember the legacy of that country. So the positive aspects of its heyday, the idealistic dream of having this, I suppose, multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic society where all of us could try and rise above our ethnicity, nationality, and religion. And unfortunately, that means I also lived through its tragic collapse in the 1990s, where Yugoslavia became synonymous with the Balkans and Balkanization and fragmentation. And once again, the region became a repository for many negative stereotypes. And so I suppose I wanted, long story short, I came from a family of very avid readers and history lovers, and I ended up studying history and international relations, I suppose because on some level I needed to make sense of everything that had happened to my country. In 2011, my grandmother passed away tragically, and I found myself in her apartment looking at this bookshelf of books, specifically her most treasured ones, including her cookbooks and her recipe books. And I happened to open it. I happened to pick up this one book called the Veliki Narodni Kuvar, which means the Great National Cookbook, which was a sort of tome, a collection of recipes from the former Yugoslav region, which purported to collect recipes that were sort of celebrating the entirety of the region. And I happened to open it on this page where she had written next to a recipe for walnut praline chocolate cake, a date which was 2 weeks after my date of birth. And I thought, well, it was obviously very touching. And in that moment, I thought, my goodness, I will never be able to cook with her again. I'll never be able to learn from her or see the things that she inherently does in the kitchen. And at the same time, it was a sort of a grief. It was me thinking, well, I could start cooking these recipes that she did as a way of preserving her memory. But as a historian, I thought, well, isn't this fabulous? You know, these beautiful recipes that once united a people. So I thought there was something more to it than that. So I thought I could use the medium of recipes to celebrate one positive aspect of the legacy of Yugoslavia, which was celebrating the commonality across a very diverse people through food, and celebrating the commonality as well as the diversity, and celebrating just the beauty of our cuisine. And in that way, almost reappropriate the idea of the Balkans. So turn something that had become a negative into a very positive, beautiful celebration of a region, of its culture, of its history, of its people, of its food. So yeah, so that was really the inspiration behind the cookbook over nearly 15 years ago now.
When you pore over older recipes and you're reading them, how do you start to translate something that might be 100 years or more old, and with the techniques and the ways we cook today, how do you balance the significance and historical aspect of Balkan cuisine with practical aspects of cooking today?
I suppose a lot of trial and error initially. So, unfortunately, like in many cultures around the world, a lot of my inherited recipes are what I call by eye measurements or indicative measurements. So, they will be things like cups, but not necessarily the cups that are familiar to your American listeners. They will be in our culture. We use something called a filcan, which is a Turkish word for a Turkish coffee cup. Now, everybody has different sizes of coffee cups. So finding the right one is difficult. And when it's a recipe that works by volume, so for example, you're using 1 cup of flour, 2 cups of yogurt, 3 cups of water, whatever it is, or a packet of yeast, then it's about trying to work out what size that packet of yeast at the time the book was written might have been, whether it was 7 grams or 10 grams or something else entirely. And so you look at, I started by looking at the, I suppose I started by looking at the structure of the recipe, try and work out if it was a bread, try and work out the percentage of liquid to flour, or just try and remember if I had it, then it was quite easy because I knew what I was trying to recreate in terms of texture and shape. But a lot of these historical cookbooks don't have photographs. So if it wasn't something that I was familiar, then it required a little bit of historical research to try and find either photos or try and find something similar from other cultures. So it's a little bit of investigative journalism. It's a little bit of historical analysis. It's memory. It's anthropological exercise in terms of talking to other people, who were still alive, maybe talking to my mother as well to see if she remembered a similar recipe from the period. So I suppose that it's first of all, you have to try and figure out what the historical recipe was going for before you try and translate it so that it is practical and you can make it work for a modern audience, I suppose.
Okay,
so
sure.
I suppose so I traveled the region extensively over the years. So I was very familiar with a lot of the regional specialities. And when I started writing the book in earnest, I did a very old school thing. I drew a map of the region I was covering, which is in scope of the book. So that is the former Yugoslavia, the republics that formed part of it, which were 6 of them. And at the time, 2 autonomous provinces, one of which has now become a country, Kosovo. So I just drew a map of the former Yugoslavia and the surrounding region. And I started simply listing recipes that were associated with particular regions or places on the map. And then it was just a question of balancing between all of them. So allocating equally to each region, allocating between different types of recipes. So things like mezes or meat or seafood, and then balancing the sweets. So kind of different things that are associated with different. So really it was just trying to be very fair in terms of how I was allocating recipes. But ultimately the recipes had to be, for me, story-led. So they were recipes which were either personal to me and my connection with the Balkans, or my family, or which had a connection with a particular aspect of Balkan cuisine that I wanted to cover. So whether I wanted to highlight a particular kind of Balkan ritual in terms of how we eat, or whether I wanted a recipe that would speak to a similar collection of recipes. For example, the Balkans famously has quite a lot of bean recipes and legume recipes. So how could I, which recipe should I use to be sort of the beacon for this kind of dish, variants of which you can find across the region. So it was a lot of balancing aspects of fairness across the region, but also highlighting unique aspects of how we eat, of the culinary culture, of the history, of things that are important, things that reflect commonality as well as diversity across the cuisine.
I want to ask you about your inclusion of a significant number of vegetarian and vegan recipes in the cookbook. Over half the recipes are vegetarian or vegan. And this isn't from a region that's traditionally known for being very meat-centric. Is that just a misrepresentation or a misunderstanding of the cuisine, or is it something that you discovered yourself on your own?
It is. So, yes, I believe that is a misconception, that Balkan cuisine is quite meat-centric. It has certainly become very meat-focused in recent years, but and it's undoubtedly meat production and consumption of meat is an important aspect of the region's culinary culture. So, livestock rearing, hunting, but this is a region that has been plagued by successive empires. So you have a legacy of colonies here. You have a legacy of wars, and the unifying aspect of the historical legacy on the region is upheaval, and what comes with that is poverty. And so meat was an indulgence. It was reserved for very special occasions. And the unifying feature, I would argue, of Balkan cuisine is that we use meat very cleverly. So a little bit goes a long way. There's very much a culture of nose to tail eating. So all parts of an animal are utilized. Animals are, reared and then killed at a particular time of year. And then from that, the meat is apportioned for various uses, either for immediate consumption or cured or otherwise preserved and smoked, or cured, or as I say, otherwise preserved, and so it's used sparingly. So it's heavily padded out with legumes and vegetables and grains, and so we have a lot of this, the influence of the Ottoman or the Levantine legacy, really, that we've taken stuffing things and wrapping things to a whole different level, including with fermented cabbage, so the whole heads of sour cabbage, which we then use a little bit of smoked pork or smoked lamb or smoked beef, for example, and the filling is a little bit of meat padded out heavily with rice, for example. So I would say, yes, meat is important. It's particularly important in certain regions. For example, in Serbia, pork production, and Croatia, pork production is very important, as well as in towards Slovenia. Then other parts, lamb is very important. In Istria, for example, it's beef as well. So different, the type of meat preferred varies across the region, and a lot of that is to do with kind of cultural, geographic, and religious factors. But also, we have to consider that there are, in the Balkan calendar, or the ritual calendar, for a vast part of the region, there is periods of abstinence or fasting, which are connected either with Eastern Orthodoxy or with Catholicism. So meat is restricted, and it's not just meat that is restricted, but other things like dairy products, eggs. So naturally, a lot of the recipes that we make have an adaptation that is vegetarian or vegan. So and the way we eat is actually very much like that. So meat is eaten for feasts and special celebrations, and in the rest of the week, you stretch it out so that it goes a long way, either leftovers, or you have maybe cured meats, smoked meats in the week. And then you focus heavily on the beautiful vegetables and fruits and legumes and things that dominate the rest of the cuisine. So I would say, yes, it is a misconception that the cuisine is very meat heavy. It is true that is true of certain parts of the Balkans, but not necessarily all of it, and not necessarily for the whole year, I would say.
When you were writing this, how did you balance the practical aspects of cooking and presenting the recipes with also the storytelling elements of the book, such as historical anecdotes and personal stories?
I love this question. I suppose humans have been storytellers since humans evolved, I suppose. From the first cave paintings telling of their surroundings, music, folk tales, it's all about the story. And it's the story that endures, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you won't remember in a cookbook, you're not going to remember the list of ingredients or the method for cooking something, are you? You're going to remember the story. That's the thing that stays with you or resonates with you or makes you remember something. And ultimately, that's why food is so important to all of us, because a food or a dish is connected to our personal story. It's connected to our grandmother, our mother, or our father cooking something for us, and it's all about that story of love and maybe identity. So for me, it was very important to have both storytelling and history and context. It was all about the balance, because these are all important accents or elements of the greater whole. It's these stories and cultural anecdotes or even historical myths or even the history itself. You have to find the story in the history to bring it to life, rather than just giving people a very factual representation of what happened. So I did, as a historian at heart, I wanted to try and give the facts, but I also wanted to bring them to life with these cultural anecdotes and with my story interspersed with it. So I guess it was a fine balance, and it's all these different accents that I thought would make the full picture of Balkan cuisine, of the region and the people, more interesting. Like finding a beautiful, marking of paint on a picture, I suppose.
When I saw that this was a cookbook published by Quadrille, I knew it was going to be good immediately because they always put out such good cookbooks. I was captivated. The cover of the book is singular and it's very beautiful and striking. And then you have the food photography, which not only kind of represents the food well, but also is often on a nice background of nice fabric prints and stuff like that, and really just well done with also some gorgeous photographs, which I found to be very compelling because I think they represented the landscape of the area that I'm not familiar with in a really compelling way. So when you were kind of going through this and helping them and working with them, what was on your mind and how did it come across with what they produced?
So thank you for saying that. I love the cover of the book. It was very much inspired by a poem called Vezilke, Embroideress, from a Macedonian poet called Blaže Konevski. And the poem talks about the embroideress and her unpicking two strings from the heart, one cherished black, the other red, one which awakens sorrow, the other a yearning, which is fervent and light. And to me, this spoke of how all of us who are dispersed around the world feel about being a member of the diaspora, being, I suppose, away from our homeland, being, cast adrift in a world where we have to make our home where we can, but how these parts of us tie us back to our homeland. And the colors red and black are very representative of a lot of textiles and embroideries from the region. And the geometric patterns represent quite a lot of the textiles, again, and artifacts from the whole region. So I wanted it to be reflective of that, but not indicative of any one area in the region that I covered. And so equally for the internal photography, a lot of the location photography is mine from my research trips through the region. And obviously we had a studio and a wonderful photographer and a wonderful team to work with, who did the art direction and styling. But I have a lot of inherited heirlooms from my great grandmother, Keva, who used to have a finishing school for handicrafts. So in the early part of the 20th century, she would teach young ladies about to be married how to craft all of their things for their dowry chest, which was a big tradition in the region at the time. So anything from embroidery to actual manufacture of textiles. So I wanted, it was, in addition to these beautiful fabrics, and I have a lot of artifacts, some that are inherited, some which I've collected from my travels through the region. So it was very important for me to use them to show, not just, not showcase the food and how it would look in situ, but also to showcase just the beauty of our cultural wealth. And as I say, I wanted, for me, the main thing was I wanted people to feel like they were in the Balkan kitchen, like they were in my home, like they were just about to be invited to sit down and have a meal together, because that to me encapsulates Balkan cuisine more than anything. It's our welcome. The first thing that anybody will do when you enter a Balkan home is invite you to sit down and eat something, whatever that may be. We will share whatever we have with people who are visiting. So I think the photography was an extension of trying to capture not just the cuisine itself, not just the recipes, but to somehow capture that unquantifiable thing or aspect of how we eat, or how we love to eat together with people.
I really, I really think that really came through, because when I look at it, there's just some things like simply when like they had the presentation of the eggs and tomatoes. Not only was it on a wonderful linen background, but also there's a gorgeous looking dish that they're in. And when I see the Balkan penicillin, another gorgeous dish that it's in that really kind of highlights the food, like the fish and fig leaves, it just, again, another gorgeous dish. Everything really pops, and it kind of creates a kind of Moorishness that you want to kind of try the recipe at that point, like the millebroad. And, I've always kind of been bored with a lot of presentation for duck, but your roast duck legs with malinki and cabbage just really looks gorgeous. And so many things are just so well presented. And it kind of, I think it's lucky when the cookbook author has photography that kind of makes the person go, I want to try that.
Yeah. So, as I say, I can't take credit for a lot of it. We had a wonderful team, and it was wonderful for me as a first-time author to have such a supportive, in this case, group of women who understood it immediately. They understood the words. It spoke to them, and the art direction. So the props, what I didn't have was beautifully complemented by the art director. Beautifully styled by the food styling team. Or we cooked most of the food in the studio, but there were some things that I made and brought to the studio. So again, it was a wonderful collective effort, and I'm so happy to hear that came through. It's always a thrill that works and resonates with people.
This is an unfair question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. Are there a couple of recipes that you're most proud of in this book?
I think the fact that I managed to recreate the cake that inspired the Balkan kitchen, the praline walnut cake.
Yeah.
I love that recipe. It was a recipe that when I initially started cooking, because I was a home cook for until the point in time at which I decided I needed to go to culinary school. Sorry, that's my email. Let me start.
I can't hear it. No, it's good.
Oh, good. Okay. So until the point in time at which I decided I needed to complement my home cooking with some kind of expertise or theory behind or technical tips from culinary school, it was a cake that I hadn't dared brave. And when my son was 5 years old, I finally said to my mum, right, let's do this. This is the moment. I think I'm ready emotionally, and I'm ready from a technical perspective to attempt this cake. So I love that I managed to adapt it in a way that I think would work for people, even though it is quite a technically challenging recipe, that one particularly. But I'm also really proud of the fact that there are recipes in there that would also work for novices. So this is not a very direct answer. Apologies. I think I love all the recipes. I genuinely love every recipe that made it into the book. And it's difficult. It's like choosing a favorite child, I suppose.
How does it
But
feel for
yes.
you to write a cookbook where people who are in, say, Des Moines, Iowa, who are in Florida, who are in Hawaii, Canada, Mexico, Japan, will be cooking these recipes and carrying on a tradition? How does that make you feel?
Well, we're recording this when the Balkan Kitchen has been out in the world around 1 month now, and I'm not sure that it's entirely sunk in yet that that is what is happening. But I think at the point in time at which the book was published, it's sort of come out of my hands in a way and into people's homes. And it thrills me that these recipes will be in the homes of other people. So I'm just excited to see what people think and make of it, and I'm excited to see what resonates with people, not just from a recipe perspective, but from stories. And it's just been wonderful connecting with people around the world who are making the recipes and seeing them work in people's kitchens. That's always a joy for a cookbook writer, I suppose, isn't it?
Are there any specific Balkan regions or cuisines that you would like to explore further in future projects?
Oh, absolutely. There's always more to explore. I think what I tried to do with this book is to try and cover the entirety of the region. So I had this idea of going in Yugoslavia. There was this idea of Vardar, which is a river in North Macedonia, to Triglav, which is a peak in the Julian Alps in Slovenia. So that was my sort of research route through Yugoslavia. But I want to go more into the hinterland. So up more mountain peaks where I know there are little microcosms and particular specialities that are made only on one mountain neighboring to the one I managed to visit, which are very different to another one. So I want to explore more of that, more in kind of inland Croatia and inland Serbia. I definitely need a longer time in Vojvodina, which was always known as the breadbasket of Yugoslavia and has the most incredible cakes and pastries. So more of the baking traditions associated with various Balkan rituals and rites. I'd like to go more into Albania as well, I think. So yes, absolutely. There's so much I want to explore more of.
What's next for you?
Ooh, as any debut writer, I suppose you don't know whether, this is it, this is the only opportunity you get, and you try and throw everything in this book. But in many ways, this has opened more questions for me than it has answered, which I suppose is a good thing, which means there's more work to be done. So I continue looking at the region, I continue looking for interesting recipes and trying to document them. And I'm also toying with the idea of converting some of the research I've done into an actual PhD. So we'll see. I'm not sure. Maybe a follow-up book of some kind, if that is on the cards with publishers.
Very nice. That's exciting. Irina, I want to thank you for being on the podcast today. And I'm going to let people know that we have links to purchase the Balkan Kitchen in the bio. So just look for that and it'll take you quite through it. And it'll be at all better bookstores, of course. Irina, thank you for being on the podcast. It was really lovely talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me, Dean.
That's all the time we have left on the Well Seasoned Librarian Podcast. We want to thank our guest, Irina Janakievska, for being on the podcast to talk about her new book, The Balkan Kitchen, Recipes and Stories from the Heart of the Balkans. We will have links in the bio to purchase this book, and you can get it at all better bookstores. Coming up this week are more episodes. Until then, I'll see you at the library.